So yeah, Star Wars Rebel Assault 2 The Hidden Empire, the custom PlayStation edition. It's been about 2 years since I last touched this, and figured give it another go, see if my tune has changed on it. Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. I probably think it's likely that my tune might have changed a bit on this. You want to know why? Because just recently, I played Star Wars Rebel Assault 1 for the Sega CD. And you want to know something? This was absolutely garbage. So we're going to set that aside, and I'm going to pull out my PlayStation 1, and we're going to give this another go. Now, the custom PlayStation edition, what does that mean? I think it just apparently equates to the game having a proper energy meter, as opposed to the damage meter of the PC game. Also, at certain points in the game, you could swap between the external third-person view and the first-person cockpit view. I just stick with the cockpit view since that's how I originally played the game on the PC, and that was the only viewpoint that that version had. But enough of my dawdling, let's get into Star Wars Rebel Assault 2, The Hidden Empire for the Sony PlayStation, the custom PlayStation edition.
So Rebel Assault 2 features a mostly original plot. Once more, you assume the role of Rookie 1, the hero of the previous Rebel Assault game, who's no longer a generic Luke Skywalker stand-in, but rather his own original character, and is male, so no gender selection to be found in this game. Basically, the Galactic Empire is developing a secret weapon to strike against the Rebel Alliance, and you generally play a role in uncovering the details of this secret weapon and ultimately play a part in its destruction. The story itself isn't deep, but it flows rather smoothly with a somewhat natural progression in regards to the levels. First 3 chapters, for example, you're flying towards a planet where a freighter went missing. You crash near an Imperial base, hijack the captured freighter, and escape the planet to bring it back to the rebels, so discovering the location of a hidden base. And from there, the story kind of flows naturally and organically. It's not like the first Rebel Assault game, where 1 minute you're going through training and then you're assaulting a Star Destroyer, and then you're on Tatooine picking off scout walkers for some reason, and then you're fighting AT-ATs for some reason. Anyways. 2 years later, I still think the acting in this game is kinda weak. I used to call it god-awful, but honestly, I've long since come across games with much worse acting overall, and I don't even want to get into the prequel trilogy and its Razzie-worthy moments, which, actually, all things considered, I think the acting in the prequels are worse than the acting found here. Mind you, Rebel Assault 2's acting isn't great or anything, but it's enough to move the story forward and maybe get a couple chuckles at some of the bad dialogue. We're dead. On the bright side, however, it is the first newly filmed Star Wars anything since Return of the Jedi, and they do use the actual movie props instead of making their own cheaper versions. So if nothing else, the production end is actually quite top-notch for what it was, and the blue screen work seems to be done really well, as the actors and rendered backdrops seem to blend together rather seamlessly and rather nicely. And the video quality is actually pretty good too. The original Rebel Assault, at least on the Sega CD, looked like shit. No bones about it. But Hidden Empire's cutscenes are at least still good looking and hold up rather well after all these years, so it's got that much going for it. Though I still find the graphics to be a bit weaker on this PlayStation version. Like I said before, video quality is actually pretty good on the FMV side, but it's the models of the vessels in the game that seem to notably stand out due to being tinted brightly or something to that extent. Generally speaking, it depends on the level. The TIE Fighter training course is one instance where the TIE Fighter you're controlling blends in nicely with the FMV playing. And then there's the mine level where you're controlling the Millennium I hate the Corellian Star. And it just sticks out badly. The models just seem a bit bright in some cases, and the end result is something that doesn't look kind of seamless. You know, it's sort of like a rear view the FMV is sort of like a rear view projection, and then you have this model sticking out, and it doesn't blend in real nice. You know, that sort of thing. Some people might argue that graphics in this version are actually better than the PC original, but honestly, I just don't see it. But then again, it's been a while since I last touched the PC original, so who knows. Still, the models are at least nicely rendered. They look nice. They move somewhat smoothly. It's just that one gripe that I have about the lack of consistency in the model lighting, but other than that, it looks alright. One of the things I mentioned in my original review of Rebel Assault 2 was the control. Tolerable during the rail shooter portions and the third-person shooter levels when you're fighting the stormtroopers. Abysmal during the flight levels, especially during turns, because the game likes to force you to crash into the walls like an invisible force is pulling you towards the walls, and it takes a damn near miracle to keep the ship in the center of the screen where it's nice and safe. I mentioned having recalled the control on the PC versions with a mouse being somewhat better than the PlayStation version. Unfortunately, recent experiences playing the original PC versions of the first Rebel Assault along with the Sega CD version have proven that controlling these segments just flat out suck in general. You'd figure they'd fix this in the sequel, since the first game had the exact same problem, but they didn't, and that ends up being detrimental to the overall gameplay of Rebel Assault 2. Fortunately, there's only a couple of these segments in Hidden Empire, which means more real shooting segments with limited ship control, a couple of shootouts with stormtroopers, which are far better designed and enjoyable than the first game's shootouts, and a single limited first-person shooter style segment seen entirely in infrared, which is a cool visual effect for the short term at least. Some real shooter levels gives you the option to switch between the standard first-person cockpit view and a third-person behind-the-ship view, which is something they added for the PlayStation version to validate the custom PlayStation Edition thing on the cover. I generally stick with the cockpit view since that's how I played it in the PC version, and it's generally the better viewpoint overall. Controlling these segments are generally better than in the flying levels. Sure, a mouse would have provided better aiming than this PlayStation version unfortunately has no such mouse support, but the standard controller is acceptable fare for the most part. I personally found crosshair control to be a bit overly sensitive and slippery at times, but it's not entirely terrible, and it's pretty manageable for the most part, especially the rail shooting segments. You have enough control over your ship to avoid obstacles just in the nick of time, and there's no invisible force dragging you towards such obstacles, only the video playing on screen. Although there are only 3 difficulty settings to choose from, Rebel Assault 2 isn't generally that difficult of a game. Sure, the flying levels of pure hatred will be rough, but the rest of the game offers a decent challenge of moderate difficulty. You can save your progress or even put in a passcode to unlock later levels, but it's entirely possible to defeat Rebel Assault 2 in an hour or 2 on a single sitting. I should know, I've done it. I'm not saying that to brag, I've actually done it. Take an hour or 2 to actually beat the game. You'll notice I haven't mentioned the music or sound of Rebel Assault 2, and that's because I don't have to. Being that this is a Star Wars game on a CD-ROM, Rebel Assault 2 uses the John Williams composed soundtrack of the original Star Wars trilogy, as well as a variety of sound effects from those movies. They sound pretty crisp and clear. It's Star Wars on a CD-ROM game disc. It's no surprise they do that with every Star Wars game on a CD. In general, Rebel Assault 2 is not necessarily a good game. In fact, the best word I could use to describe the game would be average. Maybe even okay. To its credit, it's an infinitely better game than its predecessor in just about every conceivable way. I found this game to be much more enjoyable to play than the original Rebel Assault. Much more coherent too. And despite my concluding comments in my original review, Rebel Assault 2 has indeed aged just fine over the years. With that having been said, aside from the better production values that went into this game, which shows in the picture quality, the use of live actors, and an original cohesive storyline among other things, ultimately the game is pretty unspectacular as a result. The majority of gameplay is generally competent enough to be playable, but the whole package overall is pretty forgettable, it's repetitive at times. And in terms of Star Wars games, there's generally better options out there, on and off the PlayStation. However, I never felt that Rebel Assault 2 was terrible, I just thought it was average, and average is certainly better than overhyped visual aneurysm. If you could get past some of the more critical and frustrating aspects of Rebel Assault 2, there's a fun time to be had here. I actually like the real shooting levels, and the stormtrooper fights are also good fun. And weak acting aside, the game does boast a pretty intriguing storyline by the Star Wars standards of the time, and it's nice to be playing a wholly original Star Wars adventure that isn't just recycled bits from the feature films like the previous Rebel Assault was. Star Wars Rebel Assault 2 The Hidden Empire is not a must-have game by any means, and doesn't come close to being a top-notch title on the PlayStation, but it does make for a nice little romp that you could pull out every so often, kill an hour or 2, and have a fun time with it if nothing else. Overall, if you come across a copy somewhere for cheap, and I mean really cheap, and enjoy anything Star Wars, then by all means go for it. It's pretty harmless fun.